And thanks. It's great to be here. I called my wife back in Pittsburgh here because I always enjoy doing this, but you do feed off your audience. Every audience is not great. It's just such a great audience. It's so much fun to do this. It's such a well-organized event. I had no idea what I was coming into, so I'm glad you're enjoying it. So the second book is obviously Armistead and Hancock, and clearly for this group know this kind of spawns off the movie Gettysburg, and so I will look at some of those stories and challenge some of them, hopefully correct some of them. Because of that, though, I'd like to start off by saying I still love the movie Gettysburg. It's what got me interested in restudying the battle as an adult. Like every kid in Pennsylvania, it's a rite of passage. You go to Gettysburg on vacation or something. That's what we all do. I loved it, always loved history, but life gets in the way sometimes, and I kind of drifted away from it. 1993, the movie comes out. I saw it at the theater in Pittsburgh on a Tuesday night. I drove to Gettysburg 3 nights later. I've had the illness ever since, 20 or 29 years. It just drew me in. And I did it backwards, though, from a lot of people, in that I saw the movie before I read the novel that it was based on, which this group would know was Killer Angels, and won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction back in 1974. As a phrase I always tell my Gettysburg friends who talk about this, though, the key phrase there is not Pulitzer Prize, it's for fiction. The novel and the movie are based on, obviously, a foundation of Gettysburg history, but there's a lot of fiction, especially with the conversations. And the novelist, Michael Shara, did it so well, you often can't tell the difference where fact ends and fiction begins. And it's really impacted the way we look at a lot of these stories, because the movie's so powerful. So many great stories, but the one that always stood out to me was the story of Lewis Armistead and Winfield Scott Hancock. And as Shara presented what story that was. 2 friends, almost brothers, served together in the U.S. Army, torn apart by the Civil War, had this teary-eyed farewell out in California. And then they meet 2 years later on the most famous field of that war, Pickett's Charge, where Armistead's men attack Hancock's men and both fall wounded. You couldn't make that up. So I wanted to learn more about that and read more about it, and I found out there wasn't much. I wanted to read a book on Armistead and Hancock. There wasn't one. So that frustrated me a little bit. This is still back in the 90s, and I thought, well, I'll read about Lewis Armistead. There has to be a lot written about the Confederate general who achieved the deepest penetration into the angle at Pickett's Charge. 159 years, there's one book written about Lewis Armistead. It's one by our old friend Wayne Motts, but it's 48 pages of text. So Wayne did it, so it's well researched and well done, but this is it on Lewis Armistead. And there's a lot written on Hancock, obviously, from late 19th century up until a few years ago. There was a book on Hancock. He was a hero of the battle. He lived for 20 years after the war. He ran for president in 1880. But most of those books barely mention Lewis Armistead. Some don't mention him at all. If you start to ask, what gives here about this story in the movie and the novel? Starting to do the research. I talked to some of my Gettysburg nerd friends. I say that with all due respect. And I would say, what do you know about the story of Armistead and Hancock? Almost to a person, what they knew was from 2 scenes of the movie Gettysburg, where Armistead is talking to James Longstreet on the eve of battle, and he's talking about the farewell back in California. And he says, one of the great scenes of the movie, "When, so help me, if I ever raise my hand against you, may God strike me dead." May God strike me dead. That's how close these guys were. Armistead, hard-nosed soldier, couldn't bring himself to think about fighting against Hancock, even though they're both going off to the war. But that's the movie version. There was only one person who was at that gathering who ever wrote about it, and that was Hancock's wife, Elmira. She did quote Armistead as saying, "May God strike me dead," but it was in a slightly different context. This is what she said, he said. "If I'm ever induced to leave my native soil," would show that to people, and they'd say, that can't be right. That's not very good. That's not the story. She was there. So how does this happen? What happens because novelists and movie makers have to sell their story. They have to draw you into the story. It's a tool that they use. And this isn't the criticism. Michael Shara never said he was writing a scholarly history of the Battle of Gettysburg. The movie of Gettysburg was not a Ken Burns documentary. It was based on a novel. And by the way, that conversation between Armistead and Longstreet, that never happened. That scene is all made up, and it really sticks with a lot of people. Now, what about West Point? Somebody asked me today, were they classmates at West Point? A lot of people think that. They did not go to West Point together. Armistead, the older man, by 7 years. Armistead, born 1817, Hancock, born 1824. Lewis Armistead was through all of his escapades at West Point, serving in the Army in a war down in Florida, the Second Seminole War, before Winnie Hancock even enrolled at West Point. They would meet later on the frontier. So the third thing I wanted to say, what about letters? Personal letters between these two almost brothers. Non-existent. There are no letters from Armistead that even mention Hancock. There are 2 letters from Hancock that mention Armistead, but they're written after the battle, after the war, after he's dead, and he's merely inquiring about the circumstances of Armistead's wounding. So you really think, what gives here? You know, what's going on? And I think this lack of evidence, lack of easily available evidence, is why a lot of people question this story, question the depth of the friendship. Were they friends at all? Did Elmira Hancock make it all up? Well, the title of the book has 2 friends in the subtitle, so I'm standing in front of you today. You must figure that I concluded they were friends. I'm confident in saying they were pretty good friends. They were not almost brothers. They weren't even best friends in the modern sense, and then they spent so much time away from one another. But they served together on the frontier. They served together in the Mexican War. They built that bond as soldiers, and that bond lasted 19 years until they met in those fields of Pickett's Charge. So it's, to me, still a very unique and compelling story, and one that's reflective of what the Civil War did to men on a personal level. It's just not the same story we heard in the novel and the movie. So who were these guys? Lewis Addison Armistead came from a very distinguished military family from Virginia. The first Armistead to fight in the American military was Lewis's 3rd great-grandfather, who commanded the Horse Militia in Gloucester County, Virginia in 1680. They fought in all of the early American wars. And Lewis's father and 3 of his uncles were U.S. Army officers in the War of 1812. 4 brothers from the same family. This is their roster. Captain Louis G.A. Armistead, the original Louis Armistead. G.A. stands for Gustavus Adolphus. He's named for the 17th century Swedish warrior. He captains a rifle unit. He's killed in action in the Battle of Fort Erie in 1814. Captain Addison Armistead commanded coastal fortifications in South Carolina. He dies of disease while on duty in 1813. Look at those names, Lewis and Addison. What's our guy's name? Louis Addison Armistead. He's named for 2 uncles who gave their lives in the War of 1812. But the most famous of the uncles is the 3rd one, Lieutenant Colonel George Armistead, who defended Fort McHenry in the Battle of Baltimore when Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem. Not only that, but George took the flag, the original Star-Spangled Banner. He took it off the flagpole, took it home as a souvenir in complete violation of Army regulations, and it remained in the private possession of the Armistead family for 90 years, until George's grandson gave it to the Smithsonian in the early 20th century. So if you go now to the National Museum of American History, that Star-Spangled Banner display on the 2nd floor, and you see that thin wisp of a flag from 200 years ago came directly out of the Armistead family, one of the most iconic pieces of early American history. George's not very famous because he dies a few years after the battle of a heart attack. So the longest living and therefore highest ranking is Lewis's father, Brigadier General Walker Keith Armistead. Not very well known today, very famous back then. 3rd man ever to graduate from West Point. 1818, when Lewis is 1 year old, he becomes chief engineer of the U.S. Army. 1828, when Lewis is 11, Walker's promoted to Brigadier General, one of the highest ranking officers in the Army. So folks, it's no coincidence that Louis Armistead was a soldier. It's no coincidence that his 3 younger brothers were all Confederate soldiers and fought in the Civil War, something I did not know until I did this research. It's no coincidence that his son, also named Walker Keith, was a Confederate soldier on his staff as a teenager at the Battle of Gettysburg. An eyewitness to Pickett's charge. Military service is part of the Armistead DNA. So Lewis wants to follow his father's footsteps. He goes to West Point in 1833. It is probably the most storied career of anyone who never graduated. 3 years on campus, never got out of the freshman class. Hard to do, hard to do. He was sick a little bit. Obviously wasn't a very good student. Got in some trouble. But his 3rd year on campus, 35, 36, he's taking the same classes for the 3rd time. He's all the way up to the middle of the academic rankings, which tells you something. And then this appears in his academic records in January of 36. Cadet Armistead is placed under arrest, charged with disorderly conduct in the mess hall, confined to his room. Exactly what happened, no one ever knows, because there was a fire at West Point and these records were destroyed. But the story that made its way through the Confederate Army, which you probably heard, is that Lewis hit another future Confederate general, Jubal Early, over the head with a plate. Which is believable because there were probably lots of people who wanted it Early over the head with a plate. We laugh about it, but it was pretty serious back then. Lewis talks to his father, and they think the only thing to do to avoid a court-martial is to resign. So Lewis writes a letter of resignation. No guarantee it'll be accepted, but the superintendent of West Point writes to the Secretary of War, "We hope will be accepted as a courtesy to Brigadier General Walker Keith Armistead." So Lewis's father helps him again, and he is able to resign. There's about a 3-year gap in the story of his life. Summer of 1839, he gets as a civilian a commission as a 2nd lieutenant in the U.S. Army. There's a war down in Florida. They need officers. The Armistead name still means something. Lewis's last class at West Point graduated July 1st, 1839. Their commissions date to that day. Lewis' commission dates July 10th. All those shenanigans, not even on campus the last 3 years, he only loses 9 days in the rank. It's good to know people in high places. Your dad's a brigadier general, your uncle's a U.S. congressman, you're in the Army. So off he goes to Florida. But the 3rd day in, he's in hot combat with the Seminole Indians. But shortly after he gets there, the Army makes a change in the command structure. Who is the new commander of all U.S. troops in the Florida theater? Walker Keith Armistead. So Lewis is pulled out of the ranks, asked to his dad's staff as an aide, and his experience in Florida changes dramatically. But he does get to see how a general operates an army. He serves up to the early 1840s, and then he's sent to the frontier to a place called Fort Towson in the Indian Territory of what is now Oklahoma. And that's where in 1844 he meets a young man named Winfield Scott Hancock. So Hancock's background a little bit, he did not have the military pedigree of the Armisteads, no one would. But his father had a thing for historic names. His father being Benjamin Franklin Hancock. They have twin boys in 1824. They named one Winfield Scott after the famed soldier. They named the other Hillary Baker, which meant nothing to me, probably not to you, but they were from southeastern Pennsylvania. He'd been mayor of Philadelphia. He'd fought in the Revolution. He was a locally prominent name. 3rd son, 6 years later, they named him simply John Hancock. John Hancock was on his brother's staff at the Battle of Gettysburg. So both Armistead and Hancock have immediate family members with them at the battle. Hancock, impressive young man growing up in Norristown, Pennsylvania. He gets at 16 an appointment to West Point. His dad doesn't think it's such a good idea. Not only is he young, 16 is the youngest age you can get in, but he's small. We have this image of big, strapping Winfield Scott Hancock, right? Big guy. How tall he was when he entered West Point? 5 feet, 5 inches tall. One of his fellow soldiers wrote later that in his early years they considered Hancock their pet. The great Winfield Scott Hancock was their pet. And he is a growth spurt. He's about 6 feet by the time he leaves, but he's small for a fair amount of time. Boys being boys, he gets picked on, he gets bullied. At one point, one of his fellow classmates has to step in and fight one of the bullies on his behalf. And that classmate is none other than Alexander Hayes, who ends up commanding a division under Hancock and Pickett's charge. The relationships are rather amazing. Again, we talked about apocryphal stories. This could be, but Hancock writes, Hayes wins the fight, and it's a knockdown, drag out. He's declared the winner because he's the one who can get up when it's over. But Hancock writes about this later in his life. was the first to volunteer to assist me. In the aforesaid difficulty himself, I never forgot his generous actions. Important connections. Hancock, also not a very good student, but unlike Armistead, he does graduate. He's 18 out of 25 in the class of 44. He's Whitfield Scott, the great Whitfield Scott, comes to campus late in his tenure, and he gets to meet Hancock. There's a story that Hancock asked to be sent to the regiment farthest on the frontier, asked that of Scott. I don't really believe that, but he was sent to the regiment farthest on the frontier, to Fort Townsend in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. And that's where, in October of 1844, we have the first Army record of these two guys being together. They're part of a small 15-man officer corps on the very edge of the country, the edge of Texas, which at the time was a republic, working together, living together. They served together for 16 months on the frontier. In 1845, they were transferred together to another remote Oklahoma post called Fort Washita, where there were only 6 officers. This is one of the returns. It's hard to read up here, but Armistead is listed, there's 6 officers and a chaplain. Armistead is listed 3rd, Hancock listed 6th. Do you think they knew each other? Of course they did. Of course they did. This is where the friendship began. It's also the time we have the only piece of evidence of these guys being together that's not a U.S. Army record. There's a mundane letter that Armistead wrote to a fellow soldier. His handwriting is beautiful. It's up here just because, I want to see at the lower right corner, L.A. Armistead. He writes this letter, mundane letter. Next page. Who signs the P.S.? W. Hancock. L.A. Armistead and W. Hancock. Just a cool little piece, I thought, of evidence of these guys being together. We just have the cover up there for a while. Now, 1846 happens. War with Mexico breaks out. These guys want to go. They arrive at different times in different places, but they serve together in the same regiment, the 6th Infantry. They're both credited for gallantry. We know a little bit more about Armistead because he's older and higher ranking. This is when you start reading soldiers all talking about how brave Armistead was. You often read the gallant Armistead. It's consistent throughout his career. And he is the first U.S. Army officer into the ditch in the final attack on Chapultepec, where he was wounded slightly. Now, these guys also served together in the post-war occupation. And then between the time the final shot was fired and the peace treaty is signed, the U.S. Army occupied Mexico. Armistead commanded a small company, and his lieutenants were Hancock and another young man who just arrived from West Point named Henry Heath. And Heath, writing memoirs years later, gives us third-person confirmation. This is what he writes. Messmates, and never was a happier mess than ours. Now, Heath and Hancock are about the same age. Armistead's older. Heath and Hancock are single. Armistead's married. Heath and Hancock are going out on the town looking for nightlife almost every night. Heath writes about this a lot. He says Hancock is so good looking, he's a magnet for the young ladies, so even Heath gets to meet him. He says one night, he writes and he says, Hancock tells a young lady, I love you. Next night, another one, I love you. Next night, a third one, I love you. And Heath writes, I said, Hancock, how can you tell these different women you love them? Hancock said, Heath, we are still at war, and all is fair in love and war. That's line Henry Heath book. These guys are transferred together after the war to St. Louis, where the same thing happens. Heath and Hancock go out together, and Heath is with him when Hancock meets his future wife, Elmira Russell. You can make a case that Hancock is closer to Heath than he is to Armistead, certainly socially. But the book isn't Armistead and Hancock, or it isn't Heath and Hancock, it's Armistead and Hancock. Michael Shaw didn't write about them, so we're going to get back to our regular story, because these guys were friends as well. What kind of family life did these guys have? Hancock had about as stable a marriage and family life as you could have while being an Army officer in the 19th century. He and Elmira had 2 children, boy and a girl. Family is almost always together. On wherever he is, they're with him in the 3rd Seminole War down in Florida. They're with him out in Los Angeles. They remained married until Hancock's death in 1886. Armistead, by contrast, has a very tragic personal life. Between 1850 and 1855, he loses 2 wives and 2 of his 3 children to disease on the frontier. What would that have done to you? Just losing one person that close to you. He loses 4. Not surprisingly, he becomes bitter, he becomes more sullen. I bring that up specifically because the Armistead character you see in the movie is not the way he would have been at that point. Life had dealt him a different deck of cards. Now, in the 13-year period between the end of the Civil War, end of the Mexican War, beginning of the Civil War, 1848 to 1861, these guys are almost never together. There was one time in the late 1850s when the entire 6th Infantry takes this massive 1,000-mile march to the West Coast. They're together for a couple of months, catch up. Since they're out west, they're split up again. Armistead sent to the Indian territory of what is now Arizona to deal with some Mojave Indians who are harassing settlers. And Hancock is sent to the quaint west coast town of Los Angeles, California, population barely 4,000, where he is a quartermaster, and one of his duties is to supply Armistead's troops. Now, in addition to Army records, if you've done research during this period, you can find a lot of information in the newspapers. The reporters liked to write about the soldiers. Problem for me is it's painstaking work. It takes a lot of patience. I have absolutely zero patience. My wife, Colleen, has lots of patience and loves to do this, so she says, give me an assignment. So I'll say, summer of 1859, Armistead, Hancock, LA, can you find anything? And literally, I remember this happening. 20 minutes later, she says, how about this? How about this? Outbreak of the Mojave Indians. But an express arrived last night from Major Armistead to Captain Hancock. Here we have confirmation that even though they're hundreds of miles apart, they are working together. So I thought a really pretty cool connection that just stumbling across this newspaper clipping brought. Armistead does a good job. He wins his battle with the Mojaves. He gets a leave of absence. He turns it into he knew how to work the system. Year-long leave of absence. He spends almost the entire year of 1860 back home in Virginia. He's even in the county census that summer as though he lived there. He reunites with his mother. He reunites with his young son, Walker Keith, and some friends in the area, one of whom was the future Confederate Cavalier, Turner Ashby. Ashby, at the time, was running a local militia unit. They'd actually been called in for the John Brown raid. Ashby and his men were there when Brown was hanged. So Ashby has a sense of what's going on in the country. He thinks there might be a war. He's telling this to Armistead, who has been away for so long he can't get his arms around it. He says, according to Ashby's biographer, Turner, do not talk so. Let me sing you a song and wipe away your gloom. And with that, Lewis Armistead started to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. And Turner Ashby joined in 9 months before the Civil War. Think about what the Civil War did to this country. Just rather amazing. Armistead obviously couldn't stay east forever. He had to report to his post. He gets there in late December 1860 in San Diego, California, just 120 miles south of where Hancock is. By the time he's arrived, South Carolina has seceded, other states are lining up. Mrs. Hancock writes early 1861, a lot of the southern-born officers are going to Hancock to ask him for advice. What should we do? We need your advice. You know, Hancock, well-respected officer. He didn't have much advice. This is what he said. I will not fight upon the principle of states' rights, but for the Union whole and undivided. This was an easy decision for Hancock. He's no abolitionist, but he was 100% a Union man. It was a very difficult decision for Armistead. Now, he's a native Southerner. He comes from a long line of slaveholders. He grew up on a farm with 19 slaves. He owned a slave or two himself briefly during his life. He believes in the Southern way of life. But his history and his family's legacy is tied up in the Star-Spangled Banner and the U.S. Army. It's tough to walk away. As we know, he does make that decision to fight for the Confederacy. I found a rare explanation. I found his own explanation in a letter in his son's military records that Lewis had written a letter to try to get his son on the path to be a Confederate officer. And that's the actual copy of the letter, again, just to show you his handwriting. The key part is, I was an officer in the Army of the U.S. I left to fight for my own country and for and with my own people because they were right and oppressed. For and with my own people. That's why Lewis Armistead became a Confederate soldier. Which leads us to the famous farewell gathering. A lot of questions about this. Did Amira Hancock get the date right? Did she get the guest list right? Did it happen at all? A lot of people think it didn't happen at all. I think there's enough evidence to show something did happen. It might not have been exactly the way she said. if I think there was. First thing, I think when you look at it, you have to say, who did she say was there, and could they have been in the same place in this time period, late spring, early summer, 61? She only identifies 3 people by name. She says others were there, but she only identifies 3 by name. Armistead and Hancock, obviously, and Albert Sidney Johnston. So could they have all been together in L.A. in this time? Yes. Hancock and Albert Sidney Johnston lived in L.A. They were friends. Armistead, we know from newspaper accounts, was through L.A. at least twice in May, prominently enough that reporters saw him. He was in L.A. later June, we know from a letter. Those are 3 documented times. Could have been others. So the circumstances exist for this to happen. And what did Elmira really say? She writes, you know, we all know the Shara version when we were. This is what she wrote in her book. So I'll let you read about that. But basically, he's very emotional. Hancock, goodbye, you could never know what this has cost me. So that's what she said he actually said. She said a couple of other things that are rarely mentioned. She said that Armistead brought along his U.S. Army Major's uniform to give to Hancock in case he might sometime need it. Buddy, I'm not in the Army anymore. You want my uniform? She also said, and this is a quote here, he brought her along some personal items, including a prayer book for her, Louis Armistead, trust in God and fear nothing. So folks, this was not given to Longstreet in a tent on the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg. This is in the movie. It was given to Elmira Hancock out in California before they left for the war. Now, if this was the only account of this, you could poke holes in it. Well, Mrs. Hancock was maybe making this up. I did find another account in an obscure biography on Hancock written in 1880 when he was running for president. Written by the Reverend D.X. Junkin, who's credible as Reverend, and he was former chaplain of the U.S. Navy. And he was a friend of the Hancock family. He did some work on the book in the Hancock home. This next passage I'm going to show you, he attributes it to Hancock. He doesn't quote him, I wish he had, but he says, interesting incident involved in his defection in Los Angeles early in 1861. Uniform saying he might sometime need it. He also writes, he also placed in his hands for taking papers, including a prayer book, Louis A. Armistead, trust in God and fear nothing. Whitfield and Elmira are telling the same story. This book appears 7 years before Mrs. Hancock's book. The only difference is who got the prayer book. But so I believe that something did happen here, and they did have a prayer book. Now they come east. First 2 years they don't beat in the battlefield. They're at some of the same battles. They're both 7 days. They're both in Antietam. Not until the 3rd day at Gettysburg did they meet. Question we get: did they know they were facing each other? And the answer is probably. In a 3rd day of a battle in the same place, intelligence would be pretty good. Prisoners, battle flags. Confederates would have known they went up against Hancock in the 2nd Corps on the 2nd day. But the real point, the cogent point here, they weren't talking about each other. They weren't longing for each other. Oh, Winnie boy. Oh, Lowe. Folks, I'm not even sure Lowe was Armistead's nickname. There is very scant evidence for that. It's not central to the story, so I did an appendix in the book on it. It's called Lo and Behold. So you can want to read it. But Armistead, he leads, as we know, he leads 100 men over the wall. That is the Armistead Field Here monument that we all know. You want to know what that looked like about 100 years ago? It's a road back there. Transportation was different. I've never seen a photo of that before. I certainly didn't move the monument. Is it accurately placed? Who knows? Whatever your theory is, you can find an eyewitness account to support it. There are accounts that say he was hit as soon as he crossed the wall and fell. There's an account from a man in his brigade who says he was hit when he crossed the wall, staggered forward to the 2nd line of guns, hit again and fell. Multiple accounts that he charged past the wall and up to the 2nd line of guns and was hit there and fell. Most credible of these is from the Union commander at the wall, Alexander Webb of the Philadelphia Brigade, who wrote a letter to his wife just 3 days after the battle, before anyone was spinning this story. And he said simply, General Armistead came over my fence and passed me with 4 of his men. So I believe he got into the angle somewhere in there. They're certainly aware of the stories of Armistead being assisted by Union soldiers. We all have Masonic implications. Lewis and Armistead, very proud member of the Masons. The first one is that he used a Masonic phrase for distress, son of a widow, and Union soldiers who were Masons rushed forward to help their brother Mason carry him off the field. Enough accounts that, probably happened, but folks, there's no way the Union Army is letting a wounded Confederate general just lay there on the field, even for intelligence purposes. They would have picked him up. He's being carried off whether he's a Mason or not. The second one is his encounter with Union Captain Henry Bingham, who's a staff officer on Hancock's staff. Bingham is a Mason. Armistead's a Mason. Hancock's a Mason. As a result, we have the very beautiful friend-to-friend Masonic memorial at the entrance to the cemetery annex. Think about this. I could find no evidence that Bingham came forward because they were Masons, that he helped them because they were Masons. I thought I would find something. It simply doesn't exist. The only people who know are Armistead and Bingham. Armistead died 2 days later. Bingham wrote about it twice in his life, both in private letters to his fellow Mason Hancock. Never mentioned it. There are no accounts of Bingham said or Bingham told me. And in addition, if you read Bingham's full account, he's told there's a wounded Confederate officer. He's originally told it's James Longstreet, who is not a Mason. He's going to help him anyway. So who knows about that part of the story? But the monument is very legit because they all were Masons. Now, Bingham, writing about this years later, obviously Armistead and Bingham introduced themselves. Armistead hears on Hancock's staff that Winfield Scott Hancock, yes, Armistead said he's an old and valued friend. And then according to Bingham, he says, this is writing to Hancock. Regret Burkman to Armistead. Controversial to this day. A lot of folks think that meant Armistead was recanting. Everything I know about Lewis Armistead, he was not recanting. He was a proud Confederate soldier. I don't know if Bingham quoted him correctly or not, but I just never bought that part of it. Armistead is carried to the George Spangler farm. The foundation out there has done a great job restoring that as a field hospital. Doctors think he'll survive. They're astonished when he dies 2 days later. They don't know a lot about germs. There might have been a wound, I guess, that they didn't notice. The medical people that I talked to and Wayne Motts talked to called it, try to pronounce it correctly, pulmonary embolism. They think he got from his wound in the leg, created a blood clot, went to his lung that would have killed him quickly. He's buried on a shallow grave in the Spangler farm, and the story might have ended there if not for a cold-hearted Gettysburg doctor who dug him up thinking that Armistead's body or family would pay for the body. And he's right. I run correspondence between the doctor's friend and Lewis's first cousin down in Baltimore, Christopher Hughes Armistead, the son of the hero Fort McHenry. He wants the body. October that year, they do a deal, $100. The body is sent to Christopher in Baltimore. He takes it to Old St. Paul's Cemetery, buries it in the same family vault as his famous uncle, George Armistead of Fort McHenry. A lot of mystery about this. I was on a tour not long ago where the ranger said, we know he's in Old St. Paul's, but we're not sure where. This is where. It's a private cemetery, but I was able to get my way in there, so their nameplates side by side from different wars, Lewis Armistead, George Armistead. So that's the Armistead story. Hancock eerily wounded about the same time. A couple of 100 yards, almost in a straight line. He recovers, but he never fully recovers. He never regains full strength. And I think that's why he didn't ever get command of his own army. He was certainly on that track. He has a pretty good day at Spotsylvania and serves for the rest of the war, but I really think that held him back. He remains in the Army, though, the rest of his life. Interesting post-war career. He oversees the execution of the Lincoln conspirators. He fights Indians in Kansas. He's briefly military governor of Louisiana, controversially gets in a big feud with U.S. Grant. And he runs for president 3 times. He was the nominee in 1880, but he was in the process 3 times, twice before that. 1880, he runs against Garfield, loses very close election. 9,000 votes out of 9 million cast. Retires from public life, remains in the Army, comes back to Gettysburg for the final time in 1885, where he famously argues with the historian John Batchelder on the location of the proposed Armistead Wounding Monument, Hancock Wounding Monument. That's where it is today. It was put up after Hancock's death. Hancock insisted it should be much closer to the anchor. I don't know if he was worried about his reputation. None of us questioned Winfield Scott Hancock's bravery. But good thing he came back here, because the next day he took Batchelor and several others on a tour of the battlefield. How cool would that have been 22 years later to walk and ride the field with Winfield Scott Hancock? Several months later, however, early 1886, he contracts an illness and he dies. He is buried in this vault in Norristown, Pennsylvania, that he built when his daughter died as a teenager. Now, the Armistead Hancock story was not very well known or talked about much late 19th century. It wasn't talked about at all early 20th century. It faded. Wasn't until the 1950s when the great historian Bruce Catton, in his book Glory Road, wrote about the friendship using Elmira Hancock's book as a source for the first time. And it took off. The public loved it. Shelby Foote put it in his trilogy. Michael Shara put it in Killer Angels. The movie Gettysburg picked it up. Now it's one of the most famous stories of the battle, one of those overnight sensations that took 100 years. The only one who might not have been surprised is their old friend Henry Heath. I close with this quote from Heath's book, never seen it used before. Armistead killed by Hancock's troops and Hancock wounded by one of Armistead's commanders. What a commentary on Civil War. Thank you. I'm going to ask for a question or two. Stephen's back. I'll be around afterwards. Anybody have a question? No questions. Okay.